Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus with the latest deck tech for the deck that we're going to be rolling with for the next couple weeks, most likely. A couple of adjustments made to the deck, and the final deck list will be going up on our Patreon sideboard guide, available to our Patreons for $1 a month or more support. As we do a updated sideboard guide twice a month for our patrons. Go ahead and check that out. Link is down below. So, major change from last version was 2 copies of Flames of the Bloodhand. One thing we noticed in the last time out for the deck is that we were staring down a lot of anti-burn tech. Anything from Leyline of Sanctity to Weather the Storm to so many other things, and it's possible that just 4 Skull Cracks isn't enough. So, other options you can consider things like Rampaging Ferostodon, Tybalt, Fiend-Blooded. There's a couple other different things, but Flames of the Bloodhand plays with the instant speed game. You want to be playing most in those situations anyway. This card replaced the core Firewalkers. Despite the tremendous amount of burn hate, I've been seeing a lot of the online lists. I really haven't seen that many burn mirrors. That said, maybe that'll come back to bite us in this league, but as far as that goes, Flames of the Bloodhand, main thing we're trying out. One thing that will probably change in the final version of the list is I will probably do 1 copy of Shattering Spree instead of Smash the Smithereens. That way there's a little bit more flexibility hitting things like Chalice and stuff, having a card that can kind of wipe the board against some of these Wurza decks and such. I think Smash the Smithereens is a great card, I think, but diversifying your anti-artifact things is a good thing. Beyond that, a lot of people have questioned the effectiveness of something like Exquisite Firecraft. I still think with the high presence of blue decks in the format, you still want a card to be able to punch through a screen of counterspells, especially with 3 Fairy, kind of limiting our ability to play in the instant speed game. Searing Blood, still a reasonable card in a lot of matchups. Still leaving a couple rest in pieces. This helps shut down Where's a Combo. Helps attack random graveyard decks, even value decks. One of the new cards that's popping up in some of these control decks is Drown and Lock, and if you don't have a graveyard, the card's kind of pointless. So, Rest in Peace is certainly a card that can attack that angle of things. Still a couple Path Exiles to deal with creatures, and the main deck is still, current configuration is still the same. Probably the weakest card's probably still the one of Grim Lavamancer. And as I specified before, the reason we're playing the one of Lavamancer is to have a way to get down on turn 1 to have an answer to a turn 2 Stoneforge Mystic, which some decks are still obviously playing, testing out and trying. Beyond that, not really a whole lot new to the deck, just mainly some adjustments to the sideboard from what we saw last time out, with even Tron decks packing a tremendous amount of main deck burn hate in the form of stuff like Thragtusk and such. So that's where we're at with the deck. The final list that will be going up on Patreon also will have 1 Smash the Smithereens cut for a Shattering Spree, just once again to have a diversity of answers to artifacts. As a friendly reminder, if you like what you're seeing on the channel, please consider subscribing, giving us a thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below. On to the games. We are back for game number 1, match number 1 of this league. We will be on the play, which obviously is awesome. And end up with this kind of crappy 4-land hand. It's going to force us to mulligan, which is unfortunate. Searing Blaze can be reasonable. These are all reasonable cards, especially on the play, but having 4 lands just cannot keep those kind of hands. Very similar hand to what we just saw, but we still get to get one of these lands out of our hand. So 3 and 3, and with a redraw, is perfectly reasonable against most opponents. Decide to get rid of the shock land since we don't really need it right now. Opponent reveals Spire Bluff Canal and immediately bolts our Goblin God. Perhaps a small bit of a mistake here. We go ahead and Boros Charm our opponent. So some type of blue-red deck. Obviously we're not quite sure much beyond that. Polluted Delta. That probably starts to indicate that maybe we're up against a Grixis variety. One thing we are probably not going to see out of them is Death Shadow, since they're not aggressively affecting their life total. Going to have to discard there. Go ahead and attack with the Kuligans command us. It's possible that I was supposed to Skullcrack on that end step to kind of overtax their mana here on the previous end step. You know, here we get to cast the Lightning Helix, but they do have Force of Negation. Kind of an odd timing for Force of Negation, honestly. Go ahead and bolt them. Unfortunately, we're out of resources, so they go ahead and deploy, I believe, a Tassiger here. We try to Boros Charm them. We have Drown and Lock, which is an interesting little card. It's kind of a split negate based on the number of cards in your graveyard, and it's a removal spell based on the number of cards in your graveyard. So, not very good against things like Tron and such, but, well, I guess it can hit some of Tron's setup spells. It's not very good against Tron's payoff cards. But against a lot of the rest of the format, you know, most decks do a pretty decent job of filling their graveyard. Even like Burn inadvertently putting cards in the graveyard, and then playing cards like Thought Scour, you could target your opponent. So this is like kind of a combination of like Mana Leak / Cast Down for a lot of times, which is a pretty reasonable thing for a hybrid split blue-black mana there. I do need to jump through some hoops to do that, but into the story. Another interesting card. Costs 3 less if you cast. An opponent has 7 more cards in their graveyard. So a couple new cards from the Throne of Eldraine set, along with Mystic Sanctuary. Let's put instant sorceries back on top of their deck if they happen to come into play on tap, but they do require the control of 3 or more other islands. They only had 2, so they weren't able to return one of these. Quite an interesting little setup. Opponent obviously starts pressuring us here. We play Swift Spear, they Fatal Push it. We're drawing a little bit of land heavy here now. Opponent Thought Scours. They go ahead and attack. They do show us Spell Snare here, which makes the Snapcaster problematic. Go ahead and do this. Try to suspend the Rift Bolt. Still trying to overload their mana, hoping they don't have a Snapcaster here. Unfortunately, they have the Snappy to Flashback Bolt. So, we're pretty dead, and even if they didn't Flashback Bolt, we need to bolt the Snapcaster, and then we're still dead to this plus any other random card, but I'm going to guess they were going for Lightning Bolt. It's possible I should waiver them for them to at least target the card, but Grixis, a little bit of a rough start with a mulligan down to 6, and then we lost another card to the Kolaghan's Command. Maybe I should have been able to deploy all the cards in my hand. They Force of Negation, kind of a random card, but as random as it may have been, it may also have saved them the 3 life that didn't kill them. So, not the tightest play from our opponent, but when you're a little bit more on the flood side, and, well, not really on the flood side, but when you're a little bit more on the low resource side, and your opponent can answer you card for card for card for card, a little bit difficult sometimes to leverage enough to kill your opponent, especially when they're able to get a quick clock down like a turn 3 or turn 4 Tassiger. Anyways, on to game number 2. So we're back here for sideboarding for game number 2. I boarded out the Lavamancer and the Searing Blazes, and along with a couple copies of Skewer the Critics, which can be harder to turn on against a removal and counterspell heavy deck. I brought in the 2 Flames of the Blood Hand, the 2 Skullcracks, and the copies of Exquisite Firecraft. The one thing to look for out of Grixis decks especially is, in addition to something like, you know, more counter spells, you're probably looking at something like Collective Brutality out of the sideboard, and especially if it's anything like last league where we saw an abundance of anti-burn hate, you'll probably see multiple copies of Collective Brutality. When you pair those with Snapcaster Mages, it could get a little bit rough, so you want as many anti-life gain cards available as possible. And then obviously Searing Blaze is probably only reasonable against any man lands they might have, and against copies of Snapcaster Mage. So opponent gets to kind of decide when they deploy into the face of something like that particular card. So they show us Into the Story, which is an interesting card. I kind of make a mistake here our opponent fetches, I take the opportunity to Lightning Helix them. Now there's two problems with this line here. Against normal control decks, Lightning Helixing on one is not a huge deal. Most life gain spells out of, especially the blue-white base decks, are timely reinforcements, so you have till turn 3. But as I got done talking about in the kind of sideboarding and stuff, one card to watch out for is Collective Brutality, and I can almost guarantee you our opponent has it in their deck. Whether they have it in their hand or not, kind of hard to say. They did keep their 7 really quick, so Nunners probably expect they have some type of interaction. So I get this 3 points of damage in here, but they fetch the Watery Grave, play that, and as you see, they were paying costs. Fully escalated Collective Brutality. They get full value on this. We could have held up Skullcrack to prevent them from life gain. That puts them to 14, which kind of sucks. They would have roughly been at the same spot overall, life total wise. Opponent does the thing. I use this opportunity to try to resolve a Boros Charm. We get another land. Opponent casts Thought Scour. So it looks like they have Cryptic Mana up. I draw another card here. Flooding out a little bit, which is unfortunate, especially when our opponent's at a relatively low life total. And notably, they did hit one of our mountains and our other Sacred Foundries in our hand. So, try to cast Eidolon. They end of the story. Eidolon resolves. They go to 6. We try to Skullcrack them. They go to 3. So, opponent, Collective Brutality. So, if we would have Skullcracked our opponent earlier, they would have been at 1 instead of the 3 that they're currently at. So this Eidolon trigger would have killed them. So, unfortunately, opponent gets to go Collective Brutality. Leaves them at 3 when all is said and done. And they have another Collective Brutality to put them to 5. So, 1, 2, 3 Collective Brutalities, and we're flooding out a little bit. Opponent plays Tasker, Snapcasts. Snapcasts another Collective Brutality. They put themselves to 7. Now they have a clock in play. We draw another land, and then we draw a creature and kind of give up the ghost. So that small mistake on my turn 2, their turn 1, might have cost us a situation there, because they would not have been able to force of negation the Skullcrack during their turn. Would have put them at 1, so that Eidolon trigger would have killed them before Collective Brutality resolved. So in a game of inches, sometimes it's really punishing to make those small kind of mistakes. So, anyways, we'll be back soon for match number 2. Hey, we're back for match number 2 in this league. We're on the play this time, which is obviously pretty good. This hand's pretty reasonable. Most hands with Goblin Guide into Eidolon are pretty good. Couple of conditional spells here. Searing Blaze, obviously, a little bit hamstrung by the fact we only have 2 lands, but still very powerful in creature matchups. And then Boros Charm as Lava Spike as pretty good follow-ups to our creature plays here the first couple of turns. Lead on Basic Mountain here because we're going to be taking quite a bit of damage off of Eidolon to deploy our spells. Opponent shows Lightning Bolt. Opponent plays Foundry Street Denizen. Go ahead and do the thing. Play Eidolon. This will force our opponent to bolt. One important thing to note is our opponent using Ramanat Ruins means in order to play these spells, they're taking an extra bit of damage. To play their red spells in what's basically a mono-red deck, this should be a huge advantage for them in the life gain race. One thing to note is our opponent should have bolted here before playing this Foundry Street Denizen, and instead they're going to choose to, looks like, pass with mana up. And we have the Boros Charm to kind of punish them for this. When it goes to attacks, we choose not to block. And pass the turn. We just go straight to combat. You know, there's nothing here they could do. We already know about the Lightning Bolt. And this is where the opponent made the mistake of not main phasing. A lot of people aren't used to playing around Boros Charm specifically. And this is going to pretty much guarantee most likely 4 damage anyway. So the trigger from that and the fact that they're going to take at least 2 more damage to cast any spells because they're not winning the race as currently constituted. One thing to note is Goblin Grenade means there are certain draws that could kill us, but we know they're kind of stuck on 2 lands, so it's unlikely they're able to kill us from here. They instead play a Goblin Bushwhacker, go to 4, trigger the Denizens, get in for some damage here, hoping to probably set up the kill the following turn. Yeah, that would literally set up the kill the following turn with the 2/1/1s plus the Goblin Grenade getting through. So, we just go to combat, lava spike them, and then the creatures in play are already lethal. Could have bolted this, the same result. There's nothing they can play for free within this particular scenario, so pretty much game over here as soon as we cast 1 spell. We go to 5, but they're still dead with being at 1, not being able to cast any spells, and 2 2-powered creatures in play. So, Gobos generally is a favorable matchup for burn. Especially when you're factoring in cards like Searing Blood, Searing Blaze. Goblins can certainly win, especially if they have things like Dragon's Claw on the sideboard, which I'm suspecting most of these decks are coming heavily prepared for the red mirrors. So, something to consider when we're sideboarding. With that, let's get into the sideboard. Back for the sideboarding. So, a little bit of kind of unorthodox sideboarding. Boarded out the Grim Lavamancer because on the draw, it's mostly too slow to impact the matchup. There's a lot of haste, a lot of triggers out of the various Bushwhackers in the deck, so Grim Lavamancer can actually be a liability on the draw. So certainly a card I would be interested to have in on the play, but it does serve the control role in these creature matchups pretty well. But Goblins, this is just almost a pure race, and it's very hard to control with a creature that you have to actually untap with, especially against a deck that has 4 copies of Lightning Bolt, 4 copies of Goblin Grenade, and potentially other things out of the sideboard. You know, they could have things like Forked Bolt, they could have things like Burst Lightning, etc. out of the sideboard. So, Lavamancer, a little bit of a liability, doesn't have haste, doesn't come into play with immediate impact, something like Eidolon does. Boarded out Skullcracks, because while they do, as I mentioned at the end of the first game, they do have cards like Dragon's Claw likely coming in their sideboard. I chose instead to board in a couple copies of Smash to Smithereens. The important thing to note is our opponent was playing Mountain and Ramanat Ruins, which tend to indicate the lower to the ground mono red Goblins deck. If you remember, a month or so ago, we were running into some black-green Vile Goblin, or black-red Vile Goblins decks. Those are even more incentivized reasons to bring in Smash the Smithereens. I'm not really sure why that deck tailed off, other than maybe the same people that were playing that were the ones that picked up the Stoneforge Mystic decks. So beyond that, shaved a Boros Charm, shaved a couple of Skullcracks, brought in the Lavamancer, brought in 2 Searing Bloods, obviously good against a deck with a bunch of X1s and X2s, and then brought in 2 copies of Smash the Smithereens to counteract Dragon's Claw in case we saw it. You want an out to that card because it can be a game over in a lot of scenarios. We're on the draw, obviously. This hand's a very controlling hand, but on the draw, that's what you kind of want in the matchup anyway. You have bolts into blazes and bloods, so most of the opponent's creatures aren't going to get in for a ton of damage. Them leaving on Ramanat Ruins tends to indicate that they have a very painful mana base hand. They go Burning Tree into Burning Tree. No follow-ups here. I bolt 1, untap, blood the other. It's possible that that was a waste of a lightning bolt, but I wanted to go ahead and get the value off of that, keep their board as clear as possible to make their Bushwhacker effects worse. Opponent was kind of telegraphing that they have some style of kill spell here. The 2 mana, wasn't really thinking at the time, but it ends up indicating a 2 mana removal spell. Searing Blaze here, no target currently, So a little bit of a dead draw, though we do have the fetch land. A little bit awkward since we've been fetching mountains to preserve our life total. We go to combat, move to attacks, give them the extra trigger. They see a basic mountain off of it. They play Searing Blood. We could have potentially bolted our own dude, but we're so far from losing right now at the moment that I wasn't too terribly worried about. Opponent with a lot of lands, and they're not playing anything, which tends to indicate to me that they might be sitting on a lot of burn spells. Maybe they boarded in too many things like Searing Bloods and such. Kind of an anti-creature thing. That's one thing that people can sometimes do, is they can overload on the creature aspect of burn, or overload on the spell-based aspect of burn. So, you know, that's one of the huge advantages of playing the archetype, specifically burn, is the fact that it is a 2-axis deck. You attack with creatures, you attack with spells. Obviously, the spells are very important. The creatures can be very important, but if you overload and try to remove all your opponent's creatures and keep a handful of removal, and the burn players on mostly spell-based hand, and vice versa, you load up on a bunch of counter spells and your opponent's got Goblin Guy, Goblin Guy, Goblin Guy, and you're like, how am I supposed to deal with this? It's one of the unique things about burn. There are very few cards that can shut down both aspects very effectively. Cards like Kishin Fang's Collective Brutality, Lane Line of Sanctity. Cards like Weather the Storm are very powerful, don't get me wrong. Being able to shut down one complete aspect of Burn's game plan is very important to beating the archetype, and vice versa. That two-pronged angle of attack, well, Burn is known as a lot of people would say it's one of the simplest decks to learn. It is, but it's also one of the most complicated to play against, because especially people that come from a standard environment are used to playing on creature-based access, and to a certain extent planeswalkers. There's a little bit of experience with dealing on the stack, but standard typically lacks a true burn deck. So people transferring from standard to modern struggle to understand the concept of playing on spell-based stuff. So decks like Ad Nauseam, decks like Burn, decks like Storm can really mess with people that are coming from standard to modern. And despite being one of the quicker decks to pick up, there is a little bit of trick to understanding the nature of what axis you need to be on. And Burn, while it's traditionally an aggressive deck, when it's on the draw, especially in these aggro mirrors, it can often take the control role, and things like Searing Blood and Searing Blaze really facilitate not one for winning yourself into the ground, running out of resources. It allows you to deal with a creature and deal damage. So while they are a mana more than your most efficient burn spells, they are very powerful in the matchups in which they are good. Anyways, long-winded explanation on match number 3. Hey, we're back here for match number 3, game number 1. We're on the play. Look at this opening hand. Unfortunately, it's a mulligan, 5 lands. This hand is a keep, but a little bit risky, especially on the play. Could mulligan to 5 potentially, but oftentimes Burn as a critical mass deck can't really afford to mulligan terribly far down, so we go ahead and keep this hand. I think pitch Searing Blaze here. Nope, guess I went with something else. On to the Goblin Guide. Reveal Cryptic Command. Hey, our second blue-based control deck, and it looks like we might be up against Grixis again, with Bloodstained Mire being kind of a sad giveaway here. Opponent Fatal pushes. Go ahead and take the opportunity to resolve Skewer the Critics, because this is one of the harder cards for our hand to resolve, as opposed to Lava Spike or Lightning Bolt here. Opponent took damage from obviously cracking the fetch land. Opponent just passes the turn here. We play out our land and pass. Opponent continues to hold up mana here, obviously representing something. Cast Lightning Bolt to try to bait out something they might have. Potentially something along the lines of Spell Snare is a card they could certainly have access to here. It's possible I was supposed to cast something on that end step. Didn't really want to run into it, a counter spell if we could avoid it. Opponent cracks a fetch. Does Thought Scour, cracks another fetch in response. We try to Boros Charm. They have Drown in the Loch, card we saw in round number 1. So obviously another Grixis list. Yep, they confirm it by doing the Steam Vents thing. Field of Ruin here. I think they missed an opportunity to take out one of our Sunbaked Canyons, but they go ahead and go after our mana here. We crack. Once again, probably should have cast a spell here on the end step. But it continues to try to go after our mana a little bit. We bolt them. Suspend Rift Bolt, pass turn. Opponent once again continues to go after our mana. We use the freebie mana to cast Skullcrack. They go to 3. And they cast Tassiger, holding Cryptic Command mana up. We go to Rift Bolt them. They Cryptic Command. We have multiple spells, so even if they have Force of Negation plus blue card here, Lava Spike and Lightning Helix, they were just dead. So, once again, very similar to the deck we saw in round number 1. It's a Grixis Control deck. This opponent appears to be a little bit more knowledgeable about the timing of when they're supposed to cast their spells, but we'll see if that impacts the match as we move along. Once again, game number 2, very similar sideboarding to what we did against round number 1. Board out the Searing Blazes, board out the Lava Mancer, board out a couple Skewer the Critics, as they can be harder to trigger when your creatures and such are dying. We boarded in the 2 copies of Flames of the Blood Hand, 2 copies of Skullcrack, trying to play against the potential boarding in a Collective Brutality, and then we boarded in 2 copies of Exquisite Firecraft against a blue-based counterspell deck. Opponent, this hand is pretty good. 3 lands, definitely on the upper end, but 2 creatures here. Their deck can have a hard time interacting with creatures on the early turn sometimes. They lead on Spire Bluff Canal. So, opponent leading on Spire Bluff Canal tells us they likely have a removal spell here. So I lead on our least valuable of the 3 creatures. Obviously, Eidolon we couldn't cast this turn anyway, but most likely whatever we were going to play there was dying. It's probably their only painless mana source. So the fact that they're playing that out generally indicates that they have a removal spell on one, trying to avoid taking damage from one of our creatures. So we go ahead and just jam Eidolon here. It resolves. Opponent has to play out their lands. Once again, just play out Goblin Guide here. Opponent, go to attacks. Opponent telegraphing a removal spell. They Kologun's Command, trying to kill the Eidolon. Aboros trying to protect the creatures this turn. We do just pitch the Swift Spear because it's less and less likely these creatures are going to be getting through. Opponent took 2 extra damage there. Just go ahead and go to combat again. Drown in the lock. That's fine. It's possible I should have tried to resolve Flames of the Blood Hand here. Instead I go with Lightning Bolt and hold up Lightning Helix. Go to attacks. Once again, they reveal Force of Negation. They have Snapcaster Mage. Go ahead and block our thing. Way too much going on there, but they had Spell Pierce the whole time. So another card they kind of introduced to the mix was Spell Pierce here. Was able to counter Flames the Blood Hand, so we're running low on resources. They're still at 6. Still have 2 cards in their hand. They go to attacks here. We draw a land, which is somewhat relevant here, but not great. They continue to attack us. We try to resolve Lightning Helix. They have Cryptic Command. We untap, play Goblin Guide, go to attacks, reveal another Spell Pierce. We go to 3 here, they go to 2. They attack. So we know they have Spell Pierce. So it's possible. Actually, no. Did they reveal Spell Pierce? Yeah, they have Force of Negation. They fetched away the Spell Pierce here. So we know we got to resolve a spell through Force of Negation. I go ahead and fire off here on end step, force them to use the Force of Negation, and then we draw a land. So pass turn. Hopefully they won't fire up the tar pit, but they fire up the tar pit, and we're just dead on board with a land in hand. So unfortunate that we lose the game that way, but there was definitely probably some sequences where I should have tried to resolve, like Flames of the Blood Hand when they were tapped low. But they had a Spell Pierce the whole time that they got us with back here. So Spell Pierce is being added to the various mixed of all the counter spells, and we still probably suspect they have Collective Brutality somewhere in their 75. As to how many, kind of hard to say. Obviously, our first round opponent had at least 3 in their sideboard, so anyways, on to game number 3. Here we are for the third and final game in this match. Be able to play this time. This hand, once again, pretty excellent. We have a couple of Goblin Guides, an Eidolon. 3 lands, not ideal, but the opener is pretty vicious against a lot of decks, so opponent leads on that. So we have a couple options here. We can play nothing the main phase. We could go Goblin Guide plus Lava Spike, get in some guaranteed damage. I opt to play Goblin Guide, or not play nothing main phase, go to combat. It's fortunate that we played things out this way, because them revealing this Collective Brutality enables us to play Lava Spike now and bolt in response to the Lava Spike, not playing out any creatures for them to catch with it. Our opponent, I go ahead and bolt them in response here. They fetch Shock. Collective Brutality here, completely miss. Feels really good. Go ahead and Goblin Guide them, Eidolon them. Even though we have that Skull Crack, it's unlikely they have a second Brutality in hand. They Fatal Push here, go to 6. Untap, we draw a land, which is unfortunate. Do they have an answer? They do, in the form of Lightning Bolt. Use the Skull Crack, resolve that. Playing out the lands, while it's not ideal, we don't have any searing effects in our deck. Also, we want to leverage mana in case our opponent has things like Spell Pierce and copies of Spell Pierce and Mana Leak. We want to be able to play around as best as possible. Opponent continues to start to develop their mana finally. We draw a Skull Crack. I just passed the turn here. Waiting for our opponents to tap low, which they don't seem to be doing. We draw Exquisite Firecraft, just cast that, and obviously, even if they have a counterspell in hand, they're just dead. So, Exquisite Firecraft, for those that wonder why it's in my sideboard, I hate losing to blue-based counterspell decks, especially control decks and Death Shadow. So, I hold on to a card that maybe, at times, maybe it's not supposed to be in my sideboard, but sometimes I'm a little bit stubborn holding onto this. And especially as we're in a more fair Magic environment, I think it's good to have counterplay to the blue-white X control decks, or in this case, the blue-black X control decks. So, 2-1 in the league. On to match number 4. We are back for match number 4. Once again on the play, feels pretty good. This hand is very risky. So, I end up keeping this hand on the strength of double Monastery Swiftspear on the play. It's risky because of the lack of a second land, but I think the upside is high enough with a double creature, double one drop start plus bolt, that opponent leads on Arkham's Astrolabe. So it could be any number of decks. Could be the Wurza deck, but instead it's the Emery Lurker of Lock, the Lock. Paradoxial Lock deck. It uses things like Mox Amber, Arkham's Astrolabe to generate a bunch of mana. Uses things like Psy to churn through the deck, and then uses Paradoxical Outcome to reset it all, draw a bunch of cards, and then replay all of the things, generating even more mana or more cards off of things. I think the kill con is the... I'll have to look up the deck here. I'll look it up in between rounds. But basically the deck tries to set up Paradoxical Outcome, draw a bunch of cards, and then kill you with a card that's escaping my name at the moment. So anyways, continue pressuring our opponent here. They play Engineered Explosives on 1, which kind of sucks. Fortunately, we draw the second land here, can leverage that Searing Blaze into effectively 8 damage here. They play another Lurker. We go to attacks, force them to blow the Engineered Explosives. Once again, our opponent's not playing around Boros Charm. People dramatically underestimate that card. You have some leagues where it won't come up at all, and other leagues like this one where it's insane value. They play Psy this turn, use that to be able to bring back the Mox Opal, or Mox Amber, sorry, to get a Thopter token, we just go ahead and untap it and kill them here. So, anyways, I will be back with match number 2 with both the deck we were playing against, a little bit of a descriptor of what the deck does, and also the sideboarding we did for game number 2. So we are back for preparing for match number 2. This is a deck that I saw, I believe LSV and some other people tweeting about this weekend. The primary thing the deck was trying to do is generate a bunch of tokens, from what I could tell. Leverage Paradoxial Outcome, return a bunch of things like Everflowing Chalice, Engineered Explosives, Baubles, Ambers to your hand, draw a bunch of cards, using things like Witching Well to draw a bunch of cards. And beyond that, use Nexus of Fate in conjunction with Urza and Sai to close out the game quickly. Emery allows you to recycle the cards, basically bringing things back from your graveyard, continuing chaining the cycle, getting more mana, and then using things like Saheeli and Sai as your ability to punch out a bunch of tokens and then kill your opponent with kind of overwhelming card advantage slash a bunch of tokens. I thought there was one version that was running the one of Aetherflux Reservoir, but I don't think I see that in either build. Maybe that was just in LSV's build that he was tweeting about. But yeah, the card I couldn't remember was Aetherflux Reservoir. So, that said, going into game number 2, obviously, as you're now seeing, that this is our second match win here. But an interesting deck to play against. Feels not quite as good as Urza, if we're being honest. But one card, you seeing their strategy, they're trying to chain a bunch of spells. Eidolon, obviously, very good in those situations. Goblin Guide, pretty good. As far as sideboarding, boarded out some Boros Charms and the Searing Blazes, because the Blazes were only really particularly good against the copies of the Emery there. Doesn't kill Urza, doesn't kill Sai, which are the key cards we wanted to answer. Not really worth to bring in Path to Exile. They're not really truly reliant on the graveyard. They obviously, with Emery, they can bring things back from the graveyard, but Rest in Peace is a little bit subpar. We bring in the Smashes, we bring in the Firecracks, we bring in the Skullcracks and the Flames of the Blood Hand, because a lot of those lists were running Timely Reinforces in the sideboard, which is certainly a card that can mess with what we're trying to do here. They just play a tap land. We go ahead and Goblin Guide them. They get a land off the deal. Looks like they're trying to set up turn to whatchamacallit here. So I aggressively use my life total a little bit, because I want my life total to be below my opponents in case they have Timely here. But instead, quote unquote all they have is Sai. So they take 4 damage off this Eidolon here. I go ahead and deal them some damage. I thought about it, but I end up playing the second Eidolon here. This means we're kind of at board parity unless they specifically have Urza. And instead they're taking 4 damage to cast this Emery, which doesn't do a whole lot. They show us Metallic Rebuke, which would be a card to be noteworthy of. We go ahead and Lava Spike them. This puts them to 3. It means they can't cast any more spells except for Urza. And then while this would put us to 3, obviously they can't cast any spells here. No Metallic Rebukes or anything, or they die, and then Skewer the Critics just kills them. So while we're taking 4 damage per spell, in some ways this feels like a slower version of KCI back in the day, where one of your key cards to leverage is Eidolon of the Great Revel. I don't think the deck approaches the same power as that, but between things like Sai and Emery, the Mox Opals, the deck can obviously get their power plays down on turn 2 or 3. It wouldn't be crazy to see something like, turn 2 Emery into turn 3 Urza, or turn 2 Sai into playing a bunch of stuff out. So this deck could get on the board pretty quickly. I probably don't think it can kill until turn 4 or turn 5. But Eidolon is one of your key cards against any deck that's trying to play a bunch of cheap spells. And that's definitely what this deck is trying to do with leveraging Paradoxial Outcome. Draw a bunch of cards, flood the board, and kill you. So, when you see Eidolon in your opener against a style of deck, it's generally a keep as long as you can reasonably cast it in a timely manner. Anyways, on to our fifth and final match, see if we can close out this match with a 4-1. Back for our fifth and final match in this league. Can we end up with a 4-1? This hand's pretty reasonable. Could run out of gas pretty quickly. Potential to unload our hand by turn 3, especially if we draw a couple more lands here. Sunbaked Canyon does give us a redraw, so hand's pretty reasonable. Opponent leads on Polluted Delta. We of course draw another land. So it looks like we're up against blue-white control at this point. Go ahead, unload our hand. They mana leak us here, which kind of sucks, but you know, we're getting in damage, forcing them to do the thing. They Field of Ruin us here, trying to attack our mana. They continue to attack our mana here, but they play Teferi this time. We continue to draw lands. They, of course, have the Spell Stare, which sucks. We put them to 5. Opponent bounces the Swift Spear. They continue to attack our mana base. Not a huge deal because we obviously have a bunch of mana, but our opponent does the thing. They block. We lose our guy because our hand's nothing but lands. Opponent plays Narset. Continues to tick, getting a bunch of spells. Once again, opponent starts attacking our mana. We don't have anything to fetch. Of course, we draw a Boros Charm. Play out the Goblin Guide. They have Oust, which they can play at sorcery speed or instant speed, which makes the card far, far worse. Opponent fires up a Colonnade, starts getting in. We once again pointlessly fetch, so a little bit of fetching mistakes here. I did fetch it away to get that Goblin Guide out of the top of our deck. They have an answer to that. They have Force of Negation to that. So it looked like we were going to be able to kill them there, but they had double counterspell, which is brutal. One of the things that makes Teferi such an annoying card to play against. They continue to chunk away at our life total. We draw yet another land here. Lots of flood out issues. We go to attacks. They have the path, and now we're dead to the Colonnade. So, unfortunate turn of events. Flooded out at the wrong times. Our opponent doing the backup blue-white control plan of attacking our mana sources. I, took another unnecessary damage or two off some fetch lands there by fetching when I should have known I was out of lands. So it's important to know and track when you're running out of lands. That said, come back for game number 2 and sideboarding against blue-white control. Back here for sideboarding against blue-white control. Boarded out the Searing Blazes and the Rift Bolts. Rift Bolt obviously is a liability against something like 3 Fairy. Boarded in any type of anti-life gain measures, so we boarded in the Skull Cracks, we boarded in the Flames of the Blood Hand, and we also boarded in the Exquisite Firecrafts because we're playing against a blue-based counterspell deck. So, surprise, surprise. This hand's obviously a gamble. One-landers are gambles, regardless of how powerful the hand is. 3-1 drops, though. Pretty good incentive to keep this hand. Lead on Goblin Guide here. Opponent shows Celestial Colonnade. Discards Celestial Colonnade. Go ahead and go to attacks. They show us Timely Reinforcements, which is annoying, and they can't fetch there, which is nice. Unfortunately, we're going to be 1 land short of being able to leverage Flames of the Blood Hand against Timely Reinforcements. Was one of the risks against that particular hand. We did miss an opportunity at 1 point of damage there, though, because I chose to cast the copy of Rift Bolt as opposed to Lightning Bolt, but I did want to get Rift Bolt out before our opponent could drop a 3 Fairy. They decided to gang block the good old Goblin Guide as opposed to the Swift Spear here. One thing to note, we do know they have, I guess they already used them. No, that's another mana leak, isn't it? So we want to be careful playing around their life gain spells, hence why I'm holding up Skullcrack here instead of casting the Lightning Bolts. something like a second timely reinforcements here would have been very unfortunate. All they have is a Narset. They show us Opt here. I go ahead and play the Skullcrack since it's the most mana inefficient card. It's probably a mistake. I probably should have just double bolted. They have Path for our guy. I choose to Lightning Bolt their Narset here, which might have been a mistake, but I don't want them getting extra digs at extra copies of Timely Reinforcements, which is the main card that gets them out of this situation here. They cast Opt, which felt like a little bit of an awkward sequencing on their part. Guess they have Snapcaster Path here. I want to force them to use their Path to Exile, so I go ahead and try to... I bolt the face here. They Path our dude, which is kind of weird that they blocked it. Or no, I bolted to force the Prowess trigger, so they would have to Path. And then we play out the Eidolon, kind of put the game in a weird standstill where we're ahead, obviously. They have a 4-mana play in Jace. Draw some cards. They're obviously holding up a counterspell here. We do nothing, don't want to attack in with our Eidolon. They go ahead and try to Jace bounce. Here I go ahead and Lightning Helix, putting them to 1. That way if they would have wanted to deal with it, they would have had to taken the opportunity to take some damage off this, because most counterspells outside of Cryptic Command would have dealt them damage. So Force of Negation, Mana Leak, any of those kind of things. Play the Eidolon here. It really didn't matter what order we in. We knew they had the 1 Mana Leak from earlier. They go ahead and cash that in here. I don't want to run Swift Spear into this Snapcaster Mage if all we can prevent it. They have another Snapcaster Mage for timely reinforcements, so us tapping low comes back to bite us a little bit. It's the play line that I was referring to earlier, and turns out they don't have any counter spells in hand, at least not a Force of Negation or a Spell Pierce or anything, so this Flames of the Blood Hand gets here. So once again, this 4 mana on Flames of the Blood Hand ends up being relevant. So very powerful card, especially in a format where life gain's kind of rampant. I still think this is the best of the 3 mana anti-life gain cards. One other card that can be under consideration is Leyline of Punishment. The problem with Leylines, as always, is if they're not in your opening hand, largely they're garbage. So I think Flames of the Blood Hand is a good supplemental card for life gain. I did see Josh Milliken in that MCQ that I was down in the month of September for. I did see him running Flames of the Blood Hand in his sideboard. So this is a card that you might want to consider starting to add to these, especially on your online lists, regardless of what configuration you prefer, to counteract all this extra life gain from things like Weather the Storm, Drag Tusks, Timely Reinforcements, Batter Skulls, all that stuff. So Flames of the Blood Hand, very powerful card. Obviously it's difficult with 3 mana, but especially against these blue-white control decks, they're often having to Path to Exile you, ramping you up a little bit, and it's a very powerful card. Anyways, on to game number 3. Here for the third and final game in this match. Hand's pretty solid. The one thing we are lacking is a way to prevent life gain, but having a Swift Spear on 1, starting out with another land after keeping a 3-lander a little bit rough. Drawing yet another land. Possibly could have played a Boros Charm or a Lava Spike there to try to increase our damage, but our opponent already showed us Spell Snare. Hit it with a Spell Snare at the end step, which is kind of annoying. Go ahead and attack with Swizzle Spear. Put them to 12. Of course, they have timely reinforcements. One thing, by not playing that Boros Charm, we also didn't enable them to cast timely reinforcements on 3, which might have made things a little bit awkward for them. Continuing to draw a boatload of lands. They draw a Monastery Mentor, and so basically what happened here is I was about ready to concede anyway. Things kind of completely crapped out, and Magic Online crashed. So took a while, tried to log back in a couple times, figuring I was going to be lost the match. So come down here and find out that the match ended up 1-1-1. So the match ended up in a draw, which I didn't even know was possible on Magic Online. I don't know if there was a momentary blink out on Magic Online period. Looked a little bit further into my collection, found out that basically they credited me with a 4-1. I got the qualifier point, I got the modern points, so they credited me with a 4-1, the treasure chest and stuff for a 4-1. So big shout out to Wizards of the Coast. I know we like to give them a lot of crap for what a quality program Magic Online is, but really nice compensation there. Very quick to the point. By the time I got logged back in, maybe 10-15 minutes later, I'd already had the prizes and everything. So awesome shout out to Wizards of the Coast. They recognized there was a problem, and they resolved the problem without me doing any type of request for compensation or anything. Obviously, it's unfortunate. There was quite a few times we flooded out in this league, but let's do a quick wrap up with thoughts on the deck. So, quick thoughts on this version of the deck. Was very impressed with the amount of play that Flames of the Blood Hand got out in this league. Still think Exquisite Firecraft is pretty reasonable after that league, especially when we play against 3 blue-white base decks. So I think the extra life gain is kind of a necessary evil right now. The Core Firewalker certainly could have helped in the Goblins matchup, didn't feel necessary. And you can certainly win the Burn Mirror without it, so I think right now the emphasis more has to be on what the meta is doing, and I'm seeing much more life gain than I am copies of the Mirror Match. Third copy of Smash the Smithereens is going to become a copy of Shattering Spree, just to have another way to kind of leverage against artifact decks. Even in that league we played against the Emery Paradoxical Outcome, whatever the heck it is, deck. So still quite a bit of equipment running around in the Stoneforge Mystic decks. So going to still continue to run the third thing. Another thing we consider running is a copy of Wear Tear over one of those, to have at least some out against Leyline of Sanctity. We did see quite a bit of Leyline out of our previous league, so something to keep in mind. And then the main card in the main deck that I'm going to be keeping an eye on is Grim Lavamancer. Does once again feel like this card is not well positioned in the format. We aren't seeing a lot of things like Humans, Devoted Druid, etc. We're seeing a lot of these mid-range control decks, and with the exception of Blue-White Control, Grim Lavamancer is almost an automatic board out in those matchups. This is a card to keep an eye on over the next couple leagues as we head into the middle of the month in our next deck tech / deck example. So this is probably the card that would most likely get cut from the main deck for another copy of Skullcrack or something, moved to the main. Anyways, as always, I want to thank everybody for their support, being here to watch the channel. We'll definitely be doing some more content as things move along. Here in the next couple days, I should be getting a pair of glasses as well, which will help with the eye strain, which will enable me to do a little bit more recording without having to stop to blink or fix my eyes, etc. Beyond that, this list performed pretty well. Technically 4-1, but was really 3-2, but there was a little bit of flood out there at the end against the blue-white deck. And as always, I want to thank everybody for their support. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you for the next video.